Hi, I'm Richard Howe. Welcome to today's virtual tour of Lowell Cemetery. This is part two. I've already done one version of this with different stops. If you're interested in seeing that and other virtual tours, please go to my website, which is richardhowe.com. Look for the tab that says Lowell Walks, and the links to the virtual tours are right on top. Today I'm going to talk about half dozen or so individuals who are buried in the cemetery, talk to you a little bit about the cemetery and the story of the lives of these six people. The Lowell Cemetery was established in 1841. It is now and always has been a private cemetery. It's not affiliated with any church. It's not part of the city of Lowell's government. It's privately owned. It's run by a board of trustees, and anyone can be buried there, regardless of religious affiliation or ethnicity or anything like that. It's a garden-style cemetery, which means that a great deal of effort was put into the landscaping and the trees and the shrubs that are there. So it really is a beautiful natural spot. The first grave I want to talk about is the burial place of Clara Bonney and her family, her husband, her father, and her mother. Clara grew up in Lowell. Her father was a judge named Arthur Bonney. He was born in 1828 and lived to 1896. Her mother's name was Emma, and she died in 1892. Clara married a lawyer named Charles Sumner Lilly. However, Clara, when she was just 41 years old, contracted tuberculosis. She died a long, and slow, and painful death. She predeceased her husband and her father, and together they commissioned an artist named Frank Elwell from New York City to create this beautiful monument in her honor. And so here's a close-up of it. It's made out of bronze. Elwell called the monument New Life. Here's the back of it. It's an inscription of the people who are buried there: Arthur, his wife Emma, his son-in-law Charles, and his daughter Clara. Here's a picture of Clara's husband, Charles Sumner Lilly. It's a portrait that hung in Lowell Superior Court. He was one of the justices there. And here's a picture of Frank Elwell, the artist who sculpted the monument. The second grave I want to talk about is it's a companion stones. The one on the right is the Caverly family monument. And just to the side of it is this smaller cross on top of a pile of stones. And you could probably read the word cenotaph on the front of it. Well, cenotaph is a monument in a cemetery to a person whose body is not buried there. And there's actually two people memorialized by the cenotaph. It's a mother named Rebecca Caverly and her daughter named Amy. And they really have a sad story. Rebecca was married to a lawyer named Zachariah Caverly, and he did not go into the Army during the Civil War, but in 1862, he traveled to Beaufort, South Carolina, which was then in the hands of the Union Army, to meet with some people. And while he was there, he contracted a disease and he died, leaving Rebecca a widow with two young children, Amy and a son named Cecil. Amy was the daughter of the presiding judge of the Lowell Police Court. His name was Nathan Crosby. So she was able to live with her parents, but she was deprived of the company of her husband, and her two young children were deprived of their father. So when their daughter Amy turned 16 years old, Rebecca decided to celebrate the 16th birthday with a trip to Europe. Here's a picture of Judge Crosby and his wife, Rebecca's mother. Well, the trip to Europe was going to take their means of getting to Europe was this German steamship called the SS Schiller, and it was sailing from New York City to Cherbourg in France, and on the way it was going to stop in Liverpool, England. Well, Amy and Rebecca boarded the ship. They left their son and brother Cecil with the mother and father, with his grandparents, and they set sail, and there was a group of friends were going along too, other mothers and daughters. Well, somewhere off the coast of England, they encountered a storm, and the Schiller went aground and it was pounded by the waves. It was too rough to abandon ship, so all the women and children were placed into the deck house upon the main deck. Just then an enormous wave swept over the ship. It dislodged the deck house from the deck, washed it out to sea, and all within it were lost. A number of the men who were on board also died, but quite a few people did survive. They were rescued by some of the people from the shore. And so Rebecca and Amy's bodies were both lost at sea, and Cecil was left without any parents, and his sibling was lost, so he was by himself. He went to work in Boston as a clerk. However, he never married, he didn't have a family of his own, and he died at a relatively young age. Next, I want to talk about Joseph B. Varnum. Joseph was the grandson of a Revolutionary War hero from Drake named Joseph Bradley Varnum, who had joined the militia in the Revolutionary War. He went on to become a general. He was elected to Congress, and he was one of the first speakers of the House of Representatives of the United States government. Joseph Bradley Varnum had a son named Benjamin Varnum, who was a rising star in Massachusetts politics. He was elected sheriff of Middlesex County, and he held that office when a group of the Know Nothing Party set fire to the Catholic convent in Charleston, an Ursuline order convent in 1834. And Benjamin Varnum was charged with investigating that. Most people thought he did a very thorough job and he handled it very well. However, when he was only 40 years old, he died of a disease at a very young age. Well, his son, Joseph B. Varnum, named for his grandfather, enlisted in the Union Army in the Civil War, even though he was at a relatively old age of 39 years, old for somebody going into the Army. Because of his age, he was made a quartermaster sergeant in the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. Quartermaster sergeant is what we might call a supply sergeant today. Well, one of the main supplies needed by a cavalry unit is fresh horses. And so on the day of his death, August 24th, 1863, Joseph and a small detail of soldiers, the 2nd Cavalry was operating in the Shenandoah Valley, really to the west of Washington, D.C. They had gone back towards D.C. to a depot of horses. They'd picked up fresh mounts for the rest of the cavalry regiment, and they were bringing them back to the Shenandoah Valley when they were ambushed by a group of raiders led by this Confederate Colonel John Mosby, who's a famous guerrilla fighter during the Civil War. Varnum was killed in this engagement. Some of the men that survived said that they saw him fighting hand-to-hand from horseback until he was shot and killed in the midst of this ambush. And we mostly think of the Varnums as being a Drake family, but Benjamin Varnum and his son Joseph B. Settled in the neighborhood of Lowell called Centerville, which was actually had been part of Drake up until the 1850s. And the name Centerville actually comes from Central Village, which was part of Drake. And these Varnums are buried here in the Lowell Cemetery. And there's a picture of Joseph Bradley Varnum, the grandfather who was the Revolutionary War general and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Next, I want to talk about another Civil War soldier. His name is William Clark. Clark was born in Lowell in 1842. His father's name was Tilton Clark. He worked for the railroad, the Boston and Lowell Railroad. However, he was killed in a railroad accident. William enlisted in April of 1861, just at the start of the war. And he actually served for 4 years, but he had contracted an illness during his service, and he had a medical discharge. He chose not to come back to Lowell. He stayed in Washington, D.C., and he got a job as a clerk in the War Department. Like a lot of young men, he rented a room in a boarding house that was owned by William Peterson. It was on 10th Street in Washington. There's a picture of William Clark. And there's a picture of the Peterson boarding house, the pink building in the center of the picture. Well, right across the street from the Peterson boarding house was Ford's Theater. And that's pictured here. And it was in 1865, in April, it was a Friday night, it was actually Good Friday, that William Clark decided to go out on the town. He was out. And while Clark was out, there was a performance going on within Ford's Theater. It was called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy. And President Abraham Lincoln and his wife came to see the performance that night. They sat in the presidential booth, which is shown in the middle of this picture. It has the flags draped around it. That's where Abraham Lincoln was sitting within Ford's Theater. As you all know, that's when John Wilkes Booth snuck into the theater seats behind the president and shot him in the head. Lincoln did not die immediately. He was unconscious but still alive, and so he was carried out of Ford's Theater and across the street to the nearest house there was, Peterman House. And he was brought through this front door, and he was laid down in his bed. It was inside the house towards the back of the house on the right. Well, it happened to be the bed of William Clark of Lowell, Massachusetts, and within the room that Clark stayed in. Lincoln lingered on for several hours, never regaining consciousness, and he died in this bed. His body was taken back to the White House, and William Clark was eventually able to get back inside. He found that the pillow of his bed was stained with the president's blood. The president's boots were on the floor. And William Clark started writing letters home to his sister, who lived in Lowell, talking about what it was like living in the room that where the president died. He said that one day he wrote that he brought the boots back to the White House and gave them to the president's son. But then in a later letter, he said that he was moving out of the Peterson house and he was coming back to Lowell. He just couldn't stand it because people kept breaking into his room and stealing things because they wanted souvenirs from the room in which President Lincoln died. And that's the story of William Clark. He came back, he became a real estate agent in Boston, but he died when he was age 46 in 1888 from a heart attack. Next is another figure who was active around the Civil War. His name is Chauncey Knapp. He was born in Vermont. He became a newspaper editor in Vermont. He was a very strong abolitionist. He was strongly in favor of the abolition of slavery. Well, Lowell, despite being the center of the cotton manufacturing industry, was also a center of abolitionist activity. So some wealthy abolitionists in Lowell recruited Knapp to come and to edit a newspaper that promoted the abolishment of slavery. Just before the Civil War, he was elected to Congress. He served one term, and when he left Congress, he came back to Lowell. And after the war, there was no need for abolitionism, but he continued on as a newspaper editor. I believe he was the editor of the Courier-Citizen newspaper for several years after the Civil War. And that's where he's buried, along with a number of members of his family. Several of whom served on the board of the cemetery. And if you're familiar with the Shed Park side entrance to the cemetery, it's off Knapp Avenue, so that's named for one of the members of the family. This is the burial place of one of two governors of Massachusetts who are buried in Lowell Cemetery. There are actually three governors of Massachusetts who have been from Lowell. The first was Ben Butler, who was buried in his family's private cemetery on Hildreth Street in Cemetery. But this is the burial place of Frederick Greenalge. He was the governor of Massachusetts from 1894 to 1896. Frederick was born in 1842. He was actually born in England when he was a very young boy. His father was an expert in the textile industry. He was a master cloth dyer. In other words, he was somebody who knew how to apply dyes, colored dyes, to cotton cloth to produce colored cloth. And the owners of the mills in Lowell, they're almost like recruited free agents from the English mills and brought a number of these experts in. And so one of them was Frederick Greenalge's father. So they settled here. Unfortunately, the father died when Frederick was in college, where he was at Harvard University. And so Frederick had to leave school before he graduated to support his mother and his sister. He took a job as a teacher. He studied law on the side. Eventually, he became a lawyer. He was first elected to the Lowell City Council, and as mayor of Lowell, he served in Congress, and then he was elected to be governor of Massachusetts. Perhaps his biggest achievement as governor was promoting public school education. Here's a picture of Frederick Greenalge. In fact, one of a quote that he gave in a speech was, "A free commonwealth can only rest upon the foundation of a free public school." Unfortunately, Frederick died while serving as governor in 1896. He became ill and died within a few days. And appropriately, one of the Lowell Public School buildings is named for him. It's the Greenalge Elementary School in Centerville. Next person I want to talk to you about is also served as governor of Massachusetts. His name is Thomas Talbot. He was governor in the 1870s. Talbot was born in 1818. His father worked in the textile business in upstate New York. The father died at a relatively young age, and Thomas's mother relocated the family to Northampton, Massachusetts. Thomas had an older brother, Charles, who moved from Northampton to Lowell, where he started a dye manufacturing business. I just talked about how Frederick Greenalge's father was an expert in applying dye to the textiles. Well, the dyes themselves that color the cloth were made here in Lowell, and Charles was very successful in doing that. Then Charles invited his brother Thomas to come here, and together they purchased a mill in North Billerica. Here's a picture of Thomas Talbot. Here's the mill that they bought. It's also known as the Faulkner Mills. It's right there in the Concord River in North Billerica, not too far from the North Billerica train station on the commuter rail line. Thomas got involved in politics mostly because he was interested in policy towards businesses. So he was more of a businessman who gravitated towards politics than somebody who made politics his vocation. He served as in the state legislature, then as the governor's counselor, and he was, at one point, he became lieutenant governor. Well, while serving as lieutenant governor, the incumbent governor died, making Thomas governor. He ran in his own right in 1874. He lost. Many people attribute his loss to his support of prohibition, making liquor illegal. That was something that was a thing in the 1870s. In 1878, he ran again for governor as a Republican. And ironically, his opponent was a Democrat from Lowell named Ben Butler. It was a very tough campaign. And the big issue was who would be better for the workers in the mills. And Butler took a strong stand on workers' rights, but it turned out that the workers in Talbot's mill were treated better and had better working conditions and pay than the workers in a mill that was primarily owned by Butler in Lowell. So Thomas won that election. He died in 1885 at age 67. Now, I don't have a picture of his brother Charles, but when Charles died, his wife, whose name was Harriet Rogers Talbot, commissioned this chapel at Lowell Cemetery to be built in his honor. So this is the plaque on the side of it. It says Charles Potts Talbot, born in Ireland, 1807, died in Lowell, 1884. This chapel is erected in loving remembrance by his wife, Harriet E. Rogers, in the year 1886. So yeah, this is the chapel in the middle of Lowell Cemetery. And there's a portrait of Harriet Rogers, which is inside the chapel. And here's a couple of pictures of the inside. It's used for burial ceremonies that for people who do not wish to have a graveside service, it can be held in here. And there's looking from the altar, looking back out. The chapel was designed by an architect from Lowell named Frederick Stickney. Stickney grew up in Lowell. He became a very prominent architect in Massachusetts and around the Northeast. But perhaps he's best known in Lowell, and he's also buried in Lowell Cemetery, but he's best known for the designer of Memorial Hall, which we know as the Pollard Memorial Library. So that was designed by Frederick Stickney. And if you look at the architectural style, he was a fan of Gothic styles, and you can see some of the similarities between the two buildings. And the final person I want to talk about on today's virtual tour is James Stott. James Stott, his father was the foreman in the Talbot Mills, and the Stott family lived across the street from Charles Talbot. James was born in 1863. He grew up after the Civil War, and he was very smart. He went to a private boarding school, and he spent a couple of years at Harvard, but he didn't graduate. And he became infatuated with the American West. And this is a time when cowboys became very prominent in popular culture. And he longed to go out west and to be a cowboy. Well, a lot of wealthy people in the Northeast had invested in cattle ranches in the American West and Texas. It was a time where the growth of the railroad industry made it feasible to ship large quantities of beef from the cattle ranches in the West to the East for the consumption of diners here in the Northeast. And so Charles Talbot actually had invested a great deal of money in a concern called the Aztec Land and Cattle Company, which was in Texas. Well, James made known his interest in going out west, so Talbot suggested he go to the Aztec Cattle Company. He could perhaps get a job there. Well, when James got to Texas, he found there was no Aztec Cattle Company. It was a scam that had taken much of Mr. Talbot's money. But rather than come back to Lowell, James decided to push on further west, and he ended up in Arizona. And he became not a cattle rancher, but a sheep rancher. Now, those of you who grew up watching Western movies on TV probably have a sense that there was a lot of friction between sheep farmers and cattle ranchers in the West. Well, that really was an accurate portrayal, and it often turned violent. In fact, the cattle ranchers in the neighborhood of James Stott's sheep ranch were so incensed by him, they bribed a crooked sheriff to accuse James Stott and the two field hands who worked with him of stealing horses. Stott and the other two men were arrested. They went willingly. They had been harassed by law enforcement before, but they'd always been found not guilty, so they weren't unduly concerned. But this time, while on their way to the big city, Prescott, Arizona, where they would face trial, the posse and the crooked deputy sheriff that had them stopped, and he hanged them, all three of them, from a tree. There's a picture of James Stott. And here's a picture of the monument. He's not actually buried here. This is, his parents are, but this is a cenotaph as far as James Stott is concerned, because here's a photograph from of his grave in Arizona. And there's the three of he and his two employees where they're buried. So this is actually the Stott family grave in Lowell Cemetery. Now you might notice the distinctive color of this monument, the sort of bluish gray color. That's because it's not a stone, it's made out of metal, it's made out of zinc, which became very popular in the 1880s and 90s for cemetery monuments. In fact, you could order one through the Sears and Roebuck's catalog. So if you go up to this and you wrap your knuckles on it, you'll hear the hollow metallic sound. It does hold up very well, and that's how it was advertised. It was called the poor man's marble, and it was advertised as being basically indestructible as far as the elements were concerned. And there are maybe 4 or 5 monuments of this type made out of zinc in Lowell Cemetery, and they all have held up very well. So here's the cowboy from Lowell, James Stott, who was unjustly hanged in the American West in 1888. And that's the end of today's virtual tour of Lowell Cemetery. I'll try to do more of these virtual tours, both of the cemetery and other interesting historic spots around Lowell. Please check my website, richardhowe.com. Usually I'll post a link to the videos on Sunday mornings, but if you want to see all the ones I've done thus far, remember, go to richardhowe.com to the Lowell Walks tab, and the links to the other walks are there. So thanks for joining us, and until we can get back out in a group like this one shown here at one of the in-person cemetery tours, please keep watching these virtual tours. Thank you.